Hey folks, welcome everybody to the Counter Clipping Show. We are back after a week's involuntary hiatus. I'll talk a little bit about that, but that's not what the show's about, so I'm not going to go into it in enormous detail. I would first of all like to thank all the folks who are already here. We are back to Counter Clipping and hope to stay back to Counter Clipping, so thank you very much to Charles Latour, Carl Creeder, John Longshore, Lee Grant, Matt Davidson. Welcome to the stream. Games from the front. Nice to see you here. Husa, Kaiser Bill, Lee Grant, I mentioned already. Crusty Captain, Carl Creeder, Charles Latour, who I've already mentioned. Lind Pratt, John Clark. Hethwill is in the house. Kyle Reese, Dramaticus is here. Henry Sikorsky, Bayonet Brandt. Thanks everybody for coming. Ken Kloby, Jeffrey Wesovich, Chris K, and Kilroy. So, what happened? So, those of you who are following me on Twitter probably know I spent a decent chunk of last week, and it feels like the entire weekend in the hospital. I am fine. I have an not that elderly aunt who is not fine. The short version of that story is she's diabetic. She's been diabetic for a few decades and has given less than a single shit about that the entire time. So she has the types of problems that you would expect to see, and it was looking really, really bad for a while, like for several days. Where we are now is they're talking about stepping her down from ICU, which is a great sign. So let's hope that the good news continues. So I'm not going to talk anymore about that. Family medical issues, kept me away last week, and it resulted in some other things being delayed that we'll mention here tonight. Channel of the week is Jezza1. It is linked in the video description, so go check that out. There's some very interesting content on that. Don't know how young the channel is, but he doesn't have that many subscribers, so go give him some love. The sale vid has been up for some time at this point, and I am announcing now that it will get pulled down in the next day or two. So if there's anything, there's a pinned comment that has the list of everything that is no longer available. A good chunk of that stuff is gone. Sold fewer of the magazines than I'd hoped, but the box games went, I think, a little better than I'd hoped, so it all more or less evens out. We are still on track to do a Wave 2 video, which will have all new stuff. The existing unsold stuff will end up in the pile, but we'll circle back to it at a later time in a different way. So the August sale video, which is still planned for the first week of August, will get off of there. We'll have all new stuff in it. I shouldn't say all new stuff, because there's some more copies of a few things that were in this past wave, but they're new copies, so they're not actually the same things. So stay tuned for that. There is a giveaway video coming, which was going to come up last week, and last week shit the bed, so that didn't happen. So that will get done. This week is looking very congested because there's a bunch of things happening. So I don't know if I'll get it done this week, but it would be nice if I would get it done this week, and then I could send it live next week, and then in a couple of weeks we can actually give some stuff away, which I've been looking forward to doing for a good long time. So that will be happening. That might end up, I want to do it at the same time as the sale video, so although I guess it's non-overlapping work, so we'll see how it goes. I want to get it up soon, but the sale video is probably a bigger priority, because I've got buddies who want their money, so I may have to do that first, but we'll see what happens. All right, so let's see. We are clipping, in case you hadn't noticed, Nato. The Cold War Goes Hot from Compass Games. This looks like as much crap as we give companies when they mess things up. We may as well call them when they do well also, and it looks like this is a game free of significant issues. The component quality is really, really nice. I am super pleased with it so far. There was a chance that we were going to get to play it last week. Obviously, that did not occur. So the current plan is tomorrow night. So that's why we've got to get the NATO forces clipped in NATO. Tonight we are drinking something not new to me, but new to the stream, the Singleton. Now this is the currently available stuff. This is called Luscious Nectar. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit, actually, because I actually had to research this to figure out what it was. There is no distillery called the Singleton. It is a single malt Scotch. So what it is it's a brand from Diageo that is a single malt Scotch from one of 3 distilleries, the output of all of which is not really sold as single malt Scotch. It tends to go into blends. And which distillery you get depends on where you buy the bottle. So if you get the Singleton in North America, you are, generally speaking at least, getting the Singleton of Glendullan, which is the only one that of the 3 that I've had. If you get it in Europe, you are getting the Singleton of Dufftown. And if you are in Asia, you are getting this, where Scotch is actually really huge, you're getting the Singleton of Glen Ord. All of those distilleries are either Highland or Speyside distilleries, and all, of course, owned by Diageo. Morrison Bowmore does something similar with a brand called McClellan's, except that it's trash, and I do not recommend it except in very narrow circumstances or for use in cocktails. So this stuff, on the other hand, is an excellent entry-level single malt Scotch. It runs less than $40 a bottle, which is pretty good for if you get a decent single malt for less than 40. Here in Ohio, prices vary by state here in the States, but here in Ohio, that's the really good price point, and it's hard to find a single malt of any kind. Only a few are available for less than that, and most of those that are not recommended. So this one it's very good. It tastes like a more expensive Scotch than it is, which is great. Anyone who is looking for and it's for those who don't like the smokiness that Scotch has by reputation. This is really almost completely free of that. Somebody with a more refined palate than mine can maybe taste some a little bit of peat in it, but there's very, very little, and the folks I know who drink Scotch but hate peated Scotch like this. So that is a characteristic of Scotch that is not universal, and it really depends. It's not only limited to Islay Scotches, but that's what Islay is known for, is the smokiness. But that's also true of most of the distilleries on that side of Scotland, the side facing the Atlantic. So if you've tried Oban, for example, or Tobermory, those are relatively peaty Scotches. So I'm aware that there's good sipping rum, and actually I've got a pretty good sipping rum. I forget what it is. I was drinking it one stream. So let's see. Yeah, so Kaiser Bill, I don't know about the... Okay, so everybody's that bought stuff, their stuff is out the door. The last item went on Saturday. Yes, Saturday, with no particular problems. There were some worries because it's expensive to ship large boxes to the other side of the country, so we rolled the dice at least one time, but everything seems to have arrived safely. In some cases, stuff arrived way faster than anticipated, which I guess is great. So I'm happy to see that, and I'm not tracking stuff. Everyone who bought something got a tracking number through pirate ship. I am also happy to report that my estimates of shipping costs were very, very close. Sometimes it's a little bit different because actual weight differs from the weight that I put on it. So I am a total of less than $2.50 off total shipping costs for that whole video sale so far, which I consider pretty good. So anyway, so Kaiser Bill mentions the Compass Games Folded Gap game. That is, if I'm not mistaken, either the company scale system or the operational scale system, or whatever the other Starkweather series is called. And I at this point, do not believe I am going to do that operational scale system. I do like the company scale series, and I would like it to get back to World War II optimally. So, or other topics would potentially be fine, but they've done a number of modern or quasi-modern things lately, and I'm not really into that at that scale. So, for other folks may have a different opinion, and that's totally fine. Where I'm at with this Cold War Goes Hot topic, I am really overexposed to this at this point, based on my interest level in it, because I've got this now. I've got 1985 Under an Iron Sky. I will almost certainly grab the next printing of Deadly Northern Lights when that comes out, and Sacred Oil when that comes out. And then I have already thrown money at Compass for the Third World War new edition. And I have read Storm for just strictly air stuff. And actually I have Nato Division, Nato, whatever that solitaire air game is from Hollandspiel. So I've got like a lot more games on Cold War Gone Hot than my interest supports. But everything that I have or have coming looks really good. So I am satisfied with that on a title by title basis. So I'm like super reluctant to get into to pick up anything else. So I'll also mention that assuming everything goes off as planned tomorrow, that will be our group resuming here in Columbus that we had not had meet in a year and a half or more. So I will be very happy when that happens. So let's hope that does in fact go off tomorrow as planned. So. So yeah, there's the battle for Germany, which is of course, confusing because there's a classic game called Battle for Germany, which is back in print from Decision, and a quite nice new edition actually. Stigler calls those Thin Red Line games the Italian games, which is true. So they are in fact quite chewy. They're I think it's unfair to call them the Next War, the SPI Next War reimagined, but that is where they started. However, our topic tonight, and I think this is topical, for one thing because we just had, the anniversary of Normandy last month, which I always want to do some kind of special thing for and have yet to do. But GMT announced I'm pretty sure it was last month's newsletter, that they are redoing their game, The Battle for Normandy. So and we've seen a rash of content on that lately. So I want to talk about the topic and The Battle for Normandy, specifically the game, and then content on the game. So because the content on the game was one of the things that put it super, super high on my list for a long time. Let me check on the chat. Techie Guy 2011, thanks for stopping by. MechWar 77, that's got its fans. It's late 70s, right? So I would imagine it to be dated, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not still fun. I mean, Panzer Blitz is quite dated, and people still play that and think it's fun. So, Cockreader mentions Red Strike from Vukasims, a company that did Crossing the Line Ocked, which I have seen. Don't have it, though. Kaiser Bill, Objective Moscow is a bit different as far as that kind of thing goes, because it's like everybody versus the Soviet Union. That's actually a fairly interesting looking game, and it is not it's not on my list of things I'd like to have, but if one fell into my lap for a reasonable price, I would almost certainly pick it up. What did I order? I ordered something. I have scored a copy of The Coming Storm, which is the Library of Napoleonic Battles game on the Jena Auerstadt campaign. A key missing piece to the Library of Napoleonic Battles library that I have, and I am happy to report that it is literally on its way. So, John Madison, which game are we talking about? Redoing here. If we're talking about the Battle for Normandy, it's about 12 years old, actually. But it's been sold out for a long time. The impression I have is that a lot of refinements will be included in that new version, but not a lot of huge changes. That could end up being incorrect. I don't know. So I have actually played it and do have some video on it. So check that out if you're interested. But a bunch of other folks have more recently decided to do content on that game as well. I think it is a good game, a fairly solid game, and it is one of the battalion level Normandy games, which there's not a ton of. It's the most playable by quite a bit, actually. So battalion level Normandy games is pretty much the longest day. Killing Ground and Overlord, I think is regimental level, but it's kind of a hybrid between regimental and battalion. It's kind of a weird scale, actually. The same applies to Cobra, either the expanded versions of SPI's Cobra, which later came out from Decision. There are some smaller units in there, but they're mostly bigger units. And in fact, that's more divisions than anything else, Cobra. And then you have, of course, the Gauss Atlantic Wall and the Classic Atlantic Wall, which is also battalion scale. Wise Guy History has done some recent comment on the SPI Atlantic Wall, so check that out if you're interested in that. He identified, and I've never had that in my hands, so it apparently is a little closer to Gauss, at least fundamentally, than I thought it was, but certainly Gauss has layers and layers and layers of additional detail on top of it, and I've played the Gauss Atlantic Wall and enjoyed it a lot, actually. I think that's a good game system that I think is now going to start coming into its own now that it has a significantly better rule book. I am done. Third winter. My clipping of Third Winter is done. Now I did clip quite a bit outside of the stream too, so it wasn't like I just clipped it for 2 streams and then I was done. It was a total of probably 8 hours of miscellaneous video watching and counter clipping, if you know what I'm saying. So of those games, I mean, even the SPI Atlantic Wall is a pretty detailed game for its era. I mean, it's no campaign for North Africa, but it's like more complicated than, say, a war in Europe. There's a lot of ways in which that statement is not true. So, Battle for Normandy, the Dan Holt Battle for Normandy, is a battalion-scale Normandy game that covers the campaign from the landings through August. And it is, I think, with the expansion, it's 7 maps. I want to say that's correct. The new version will include the maps. So it's going to be a big game, right? But I'm not 100% clear on how I'm going to organize these. We'll see in a second here. There's a couple things about it that I don't like. Some people don't like the CRT. This doesn't bother me. This is something that's unusual. There are bad results sprinkled in with the good results in the CRT. And what that's doing is adding some unpredictability to combat. So you could say, hey, I have this DRM, this positive DRM, and generally speaking, a positive DRM is good, but sometimes I can land on a bad result even when I have a positive DRM. There's a lot of different ways to structure a CRT to include that element, and the designer of the Battle for Normandy just kind of sprinkled the bad results in. I have had a number of people express great dissatisfaction with that. It doesn't really bother me. The units, especially the Allied units, but to some extent the German units as well, are very much cookie-cutter unit strengths, and that is something that I don't like. On the other hand, they're not 100% cookie-cutter unit strengths, and there are a lot of optional rules that you can tailor. You can use to tailor the experience how you want it, and some of those optional rules do things like saying that there are green divisions, for example, which suffer under certain additional restrictions. There are special rules for commandos and rangers, for example, which give those units special capabilities. So even though the factors are cookie cutter, there are optional rules that help to differentiate the units a little more than what the factors would necessarily suggest. So that's not something I'm a fan of necessarily, but it's not like it breaks the game, and I don't consider it a big deal. I am not 100% convinced that the supply system, which applies primarily, I'm talking about the Allied supply system here. The Germans don't have to abide by this system. I'm not 100% convinced that supply system actually works, but that may have been me mismanaging the points. That's very plausible. And there's no, I feel like there should be, but then again, based on the scale, maybe there shouldn't be. I feel like isolated units that are cut off, are not penalized enough. I think, as I recall, they have half movement or something like that. They may still be able to attack. I don't remember. It's been a while. I felt like they should be penalized a little more than they were. Again, not a huge deal, but it does mean that you can't just cut units off and forget about them. You have to actually, work to eliminate them. Of course, that is a thing that applies more to the Germans, that the units being isolated, that is, than it does to the Allies, unless the Allies are playing fairly poorly. Now, of course, there's a huge number of other games about the Normandy campaign that are not at the battalion scale. Very recently, we've seen the brand new The Dark Summer from Ted Racer and GMT. That's getting a pretty good press. That is, what looks to, anyway, I haven't looked at it that closely, looks like a regimental level Normandy game. Same scale, roughly the same scale as Normandy 44, which is a game I do have played and like a lot. That is a regimental scale. And it's an excellent Normandy 44. I can vouch for as an excellent game. The Dark Summer looks like it has some abstractions, like handling Cherbourg as an off-map area, which I'm not a huge fan of. So that's just me. I also have the new boxed version of Cobra from Decision, which I haven't had a chance to play yet. It's pretty much the old SPI Cobra with the add-on map, so you can do the landings and stuff as well. And of course, there's Day of Days from the Standard Combat series, The Gamers, and Multiman Publishing. Now, I've played that and have, on numerous occasions, expressed my dissatisfaction with it. I don't think it works well, but I think that is primarily a scale problem. I think for me, it is simply not fun at that scale. Handling that operation at the company scale. It is, so the unit scale is companies. I forget the hex scale, but I found it to be excessively tedious. Let me put it that way. I don't think SCS gives me the amount of detail that I want. Now, we also have the GTS company scale treatment of Normandy in The Greatest Day, Gold, Juno, and Sword, or at least the British beaches, which I think I haven't played that either. But I like GTS a lot, and that looks fantastic. Hopefully, we'll be able to get that to the table soon. There was talk about that for 2020, but of course, the entire year of 2020 got flushed down the toilet. So, okay, so I agree. Nathan at Wise Guy History has been doing great content, Stigler. Joe Faust. Joe, thanks for stopping by. Mentions tactical level operation games should even be counted as Normandy. See, I tend not to consider them Normandy games, even if they take place in Normandy. If they're like ASL scenarios or something like that, which is of course a huge amount of. I mean, there's even an ASL historical module for Arnhem, which is not Normandy, obviously, but it's it's tactical West Front, and it's there's a certain shared vibe between Market Garden stuff and Normandy stuff. But there's tons of ASL scenarios that happen on June 6th or June 7th or June 8th or whatever. And, you know, are those Normandy games? I mean, they're not covering Normandy. They're covering this particular action that happened in Normandy. So I don't intend this to be a dismissive definition, but I tend not to include those in this category. Now, there's another game called The Far Shore, I think, which was from 3W, which may have been battalion or regiment scale as well, which I have never physically seen a copy of. I think I may have seen the box. Tony Mammal. Tony, thanks for stopping by. Here's what Bill says: his wallet gets lighter every time he watches. I live to serve. So I'm happy to recommend good games, though. I mean, you know, you can listen to me or not, or think I'm full of shit or not, and that's fine if you do. But, you know, part of the vibe here is that we talk about games that I like or dislike, you know, sometimes. So, okay, let's circle back here. Okay, so John Longshore mentions the infamous SPI rule where the nuke rules were to set the map on fire, which was a real thing. I forget which game that was. It may have actually been in more than one game. But that was the actual rule at one point. And he's not really wrong. So, Fast Hines, thanks for stopping by, asks about the comparison between NATO and MMP's Iron Curtain. So Iron Curtain, which did I didn't get to play it, but it did pass through my hands, and I let it go. One of the local guys, I got it at like a trade deal, and one of the other local guys really wanted it, and I passed it to him. And I was comfortable with that because I'm like, you know, I really got more of these games than I need on this topic. So it is an SCS game, so it's quite simple. It's going to play quite quickly. This game is much more detailed, but it's also not a monster game. It's not tiny. It's 2 maps, right? 2 maps, 4 counter sheets. The hexes are bigger on the maps. The counters are bigger than usual. These are 9/16" counters, it looks like. But it can be played in like 10 hours or less, too. So it's not like it's a 50-hour monster game or it's going to take you 2 years to play or anything like that. So it is going to be for folks who want a more detailed treatment of this topic, however, than will find Iron Curtain satisfying. So if that's you, then I would point you in this direction rather than in the direction of Iron Curtain. Which is not to say anything bad particularly about Iron Curtain, although I think the supply rules in Iron Curtain feel really weird to me. Or I should say the lack of supply rules in Iron Curtain feel really weird to me. That is a thing that is addressed in the designer's notes, so, you know, maybe you'll find that explanation satisfying and maybe you won't. So, all right. Cal Reese says, Cold War gone hot is very hot right now that it's cold again. But it's hot, so it's all very confusing. Stigler says Cobra might be one of the few decision games that actually improved on the SPI original. Except it's not, because it's the TSR version that improved on the original. The new decision version is basically the TSR version with the extra map and the extra coverage of the landings. So, I am normally the person who leaps to the defense of decision games in this situation, but in this case, the improvements to the game happened while the game was in the hands of TSR, and that's not a situation that arose very often. So, Tony Mallow mentions ASL coming up with another Normandy historical module. There was a scenario pack that came out relatively recently, either for ASL or starter kit. I forget which. That may be what you're thinking of. The historical in the pipeline now up for pre-order is Manila, which is like a 6-map monster, which will be interesting, actually. I had ordered it. I'll get it at some point. Apollo Gamer mentions that he just clipped Battle for Normandy. It's a pretty big game to clip. The new version is going to have something like 12 counter sheets. My guess is that you will probably want to hear more about what the changes are before leaping on the the new edition if you have the old one. I don't think that the map and counter changes will be that huge. I might end up being wrong about that, but I don't think so. So if the changes are mostly rules changes, then you can just get the rules update and be satisfied with that. Matt Davidson mentions the Assault series from GDW. That's I think I had Assault and Boots and Saddles back in the day and did not play them, and this was, who knows what happened to those. One of our local fellas, the guy actually who we're starting this with tomorrow, is a big fan of the Assault series. So there were 4 volumes in that series, and then I think there was a Ziploc expansion pack or something like that. There was Assault, Boots and Saddles, Bundeswehr, and a 4th box set that they did. I only had Assault and Boots and Saddles. So I mean, if you are in the market for a big Normandy game at that scale, the asking price of $105 for a 7-map, 12 counter sheet game is, let's say, extremely reasonable. And again, the game's pretty good. It's a solid game. I think most people that have played it have not been super duper disappointed with it. Definitely better than Stallone's Cobra. Thank you, Tony. I was actually, having played it, I was actually not incredibly satisfied with the discussion, unless they updated it, which they may have, of the changes. I felt like I wanted more detail on what was changing. A lot of people, Carl Creeder mentions that he doesn't like playing the Germans in Normandy. So, I mean, it depends on the game, right? If you're playing at the tactical level, then that feeling of constantly being ground down is not really a thing, because that may not be the case in the particular tactical engagement that you're talking about. But if you're covering the whole campaign, then yeah, absolutely, it can be demoralizing to play the Germans in it. Well, I don't know if demoralizing is the right word, because you want them to lose, right? But if you're responsible for that, it can be maybe not incredibly fun to play. So I do sympathize somewhat with that. I think it is more fun to play the Allies in the Normandy campaign, but the other people will tell you something different too. Oh, and Stigler, I should mention this too, although this is not our topic, although maybe we should have a topic on Cold War Gone Hot. Stigler is doing some material on the old SPI Central Front series, so check out his channel to see where he is with that. That is a well-remembered and well-liked series of games with quite an interesting core mechanic, with the friction points and stuff, and a lot of people really like it. So check that out if you're into the topic. So Block Oddity asked about counterclipping night on World War I games. Yeah, certainly we can talk about that. I certainly have plenty of World War I games I could talk about. When I was preparing for the stream, actually, I almost put a World War I thing here instead of Conquest of the Galaxy, or Freedom in the Galaxy. Ken, the Longest Day has been mentioned, but I haven't played the long. So here's the deal with the Longest Day. Okay. I have been on the record of saying, despite not having played it and not having looked at it all that closely, to be completely honest, my feeling is that The Longest Day is pretty dated in a number of respects. One, I think the mechanics are pretty dated. The Longest Day also has at least one significant printing oddity that you need to be aware of if you want to run a copy down. And it has one graphical design oddity that you may find really cumbersome to actually use. So, those of you who have played GTS will recall that GTS uses the period unit symbols in place of the much more common nowadays in wargaming, what we call the NATO symbols, which are not really what NATO uses exactly, but they're mostly very similar, right? So in GTS, what that ends up meaning is that a lot of, but not all, of the Allied unit symbols are quite similar to what we would think of as NATO symbols, until you start getting into things like artillery and different kinds of guns and stuff like that. Then they're different. But the German units are quite unfamiliar. However, in the case of GTS, this doesn't really represent much of a problem because the factors and the color coding on the unit, on the counter, is telling you how the unit behaves. So you don't really care too much about what the symbol is, right? This is why, you know, we could afford to get away with a symbol for the SS marching band, which is in the game in the Devil's Cauldron, and which historically took part in the battle. So the greatest day on the longest day, on the other hand, hopefully I won't make that mistake too many times, uses the German historical symbols, which are all totally unfamiliar and which doesn't have the useful color coding because it came out in the late 70s or whenever it came out. So I think that's burdensome and unnecessary and works to the game's detriment. I think you are, if you want a vintage Normandy game, I think you are better off seeking out the SPI Atlantic Wall. Now, the printing oddity that I mentioned is that, I don't know if this was printing or collation or what, but apparently many copies of The Longest Day are in circulation that have miscollated maps. So if there's, I think there were 5 mounted maps in there, so you might have like 2 copies of map 2 and 0 copies of map 3. And of course, when Avalon Hill was in business and you bought one of these and you had this problem, you could write them a letter and say, hey, you guys screwed this up, I need a replacement map, and they'd send you one. Now, if you buy a shrink-wrapped copy of The Longest Day, you're going to A, spend a bunch of money, and B, possibly get an unplayable game at the end. You're going to be very put out and disappointed. So that's another reason as far as I'm concerned. And I mean, frankly, the state of the art in wargame design, well, it may not have improved as much as a lot of us would like, has definitely improved since both, really, The Longest Day and Atlantic Wall came out. So I think there's better games, which may not necessarily be at that scale. I think there's better games floating around for your money. And you know, one of the pieces of the calculus for The Longest Day is what it costs too, right? I mean, it's hard to find that for less than about $200 in anything less than awful condition. So, okay, so Brant mentions the Grognard Sims Death Ride series, which has recently come to Normandy. I forget, I haven't checked it in a while. I was tempted by that actually, because Normandy is one of my favorite topics. So I was actually quite tempted by that, but the expense of it, especially considering that I was unemployed at the time, did steer me away from it. So I managed to avoid that. Now, there are a lot of fans of that series. I have one game in the series, which I think is the Aris game, which I think we're going to have to split this up. Which I have been intending to get to the table for some time, but which has not yet succeeded. So hopefully we'll actually be able to get that to happen at some point. All right, so there's that. More East German territorials. British units. French units. Now, I will say that if you're going to ask me for a general recommendation for Normandy games that are relatively modest footprint, and I'll also say that one of the most highly regarded Normandy games that does cover the whole thing is the Killing Ground and Overlord from New England Simulations. I haven't played that. I do have it. I got it not too long ago, last year sometime. So I cannot give you a firm opinion on it. I will tell you that it is the old Victory in the West system, which is which a lot of people like, and which is still a system that gets designed using. I haven't played any of those games. I would really like to, but I actually have all the original SPI games. Well, I guess not all of them. If you count Typhoon as part of that series, I don't have that. But I do have the other 3 that came in S&T, and will play at least the Sicily game at some point. The the Victory in the West Sicily from S&T is another of those SPI classics that legitimately earns its name of classics. And the map is actually really attractive, considering that it came out in 1981. So... Okay, Craig Campbell mentions the GTS symbols gives the game flavor. Yes, exactly, but you don't need to know the symbols to be able to recognize this particular kind of heavy field gun symbol to play the game, right? You can just know that, hey, here's the fire type that it is, here's the movement type that it is, and that's all I really need. And, of course, the actual factors, but still. Stigler mentions sort of... apropos of not anything that we're talking about, that a focused and creative Vassal module author can make the module better than playing with the physical game sometimes. Yes, that's true. And in fact, the GTS games are a great example of that. Actually, the Vassal modules for those are excellent. Brian Jarvis mentions that the longest day Vassal module, the values on the counters are color-coded. That's nice, but... I have even less interested in playing that on Vassal than I do in person, and I'm a big supporter of Vassal, as I think everybody knows, but I have no particular desire to play it on either format. Block Oddity mentions that he has At All Costs on the table right now. That's got a game that has a good reputation. Greg Grant mentions the New England Simulations Killing Ground. So Killing Ground is basically the game of the Cobra Breakout. And then Overlord is an expansion to Killing Ground that adds the landings. So it is the same type of deal as the SPI/TSR/Decision Games Cobra, except that the scale's a little bit different, and the unit scale is definitely different. So, let me reemphasize a point I mentioned at the very beginning. I know that I posted a picture of me from the hospital, but that's because I was in the hospital because a relative was in the hospital. I am fine. So thank you for your concern. All right. The Longest Day is a perfect target for Compass to do Designer's Signature Edition. Who was the designer of The Longest Day? Just because I'm curious. Because I don't know off the top of my head. We're about to get to the West Germans. And that'll be the last of the Allied actual units. So I am forced to use the deluxe clipper on these because they're too thick. They will actually fit in my non-deluxe clipper, but they're really tight and I don't want to deal with it. So the issue with learning Vassal, I mean, there is certainly a bit of a learning curve, but I think you get used to most of it very quickly. What can throw you more than Vassal itself is that the modules, there's no like consistent style guide used by module authors. So different modules can have very different levels of functionality built into them. John Madison mentions GDW's Normandy campaign. So actually, that's a good call there. Good, thank you, John, for mentioning that. Although I don't consider Second Front a Normandy game either. It is a bigger game than Normandy. So GDW back in the day did this double blind series, and I want to say that their Normandy campaign game was one of those. They also did a Market Garden game. And those, I don't know that they're considered classics necessarily, but I do know that they are still considered very innovative. So they are probably, and double blind games can by nature be super interesting and fun, and they can also be a big pain in the ass to actually play too. So that is a thing to consider. The Dark Summer is getting good buzz, so don't let my antipathy to it necessarily steer you away from it. For my money, if I want a light Normandy game, I'm going to go for Normandy 44, which is a less abstracted, but not entirely dissimilar treatment of it from Mark Simonich. Second Front. So, as folks may recall, we had the show about Europa the other day. And I'll tell you what, I saw this vanished almost instantly upon contact. I saw a very good price on a Second Front come up not that long ago. And had it not been already gone, and I spent close to 2 hours complaining about Europa, had it not been already gone when I saw it, I would have absolutely pushed the button on it. So Second Front is essentially the West Front of World War II in Europe, from, at least the way we played it, the invasion of Sicily in July of 1943, all the way to the end of the war. It uses the Europa system. One of the things that I might mention, so it covers Normandy, right? I mean, assuming that a Normandy-like invasion happens, it's going to be there in your Second Front experience, assuming you play the whole thing. So, I'm still not quite used to the chair. It is 2 turns per month, and of course it's got that wonky Europa 16 miles to the hex scale. I actually did a little bit of comparison on the maps between Europa and War in Europe, and they're very close in scale. I want to say War in Europe is 15 miles to the hex and Europa is 16. That sounds right. I think that Europa's scale makes it not work as well as you would want it to for Second Front. But I also am going to remind us all of what I said at the time, which was that despite the fact that I was, pretty irritable about the whole experience at the end and was ready to be done, I also considered it an extremely valuable experience to have played it. And also that I will undoubtedly circle back to Europa at some point, at some level. Might not be a game quite that big, but we'll see what happens. One of the things on the list, so everybody, the 3 people that we have back in the queue for the Wednesday group, which will be a Tuesday group now for at least a little while, everybody threw up a list of games. It's like, hey, we could play this, this, and this, and this. One of the games that was on everybody's list was Europa's War in the Desert. So it's not impossible that will happen. Tony Mammal says he would try Vassal, but he thinks the quantity and size of monitors in your computer setup are more critical than learning a Vassal. I don't necessarily agree with that. However, Vassal by itself is a pretty low rent on your computer, right? You do not need a massively powerful computer to run Vassal. However, having multiple monitors does help a ton. So if you have 2 monitors, for example, you're going to find that your Vassal experience is just better than if you have a single monitor. My recommendation, if I was like, somebody said to me, Gary, I want to build and actually somebody did, I want to set a computer up to play Vassal, I would tell them to go buy a 42 or so-ish 4K television, because it'll cost a third as much as a 4K monitor in that size. And a second just regular 1080 monitor of 27 inches or something like that, which is like a $100 monitor. So you're talking $400 or less for both of those monitors, and run your computer through both of those. You have a side monitor for all the little charts, the tables, the displays, or whatever. You have a big monitor for the big map, and I'll tell you, it's very close to having like a real war game in front of you, because the monitor is big, and that is essentially the setup that I have right here. For video games, I would rather have a 1080 monitor, because I'm running all the video games in 1080 anyway, for the most part, because they run better in 1080, right? For Vassal, that's not a big deal. There are some Vassal modules, which are for really big games, where you have to be concerned about things like the amount of memory available to Java. So I do also recommend using 64-bit Java rather than 32-bit Java, and then there's an amount there's a setting in the Vassal options, and then in the module to change the amount of that available memory. So it's also helpful to have a decent amount of memory, but you don't need some kind of supercomputer like a HAL 9000 computer to run Vassal by any means. Totally unnecessary. Totally can run it on a 19-inch laptop with no problems. I mean, are you going to have the optimal experience? No, of course not. But, you know, for me, the big difference is not the size of the screen, although it helps that it's big. It's the fact that it's 4K. Because like a 30, one of my old monitors at one point in the past was a 35-inch 1080 TV, and it was not as sharp as you'd want it to be for a monitor that size. That's this amount of space to my face. Like I stretch my arm out right here, and that's about how far the monitor is from me. So, you know, based on your distance from the monitor and all that, I recommend the 4K for Vassal for that reason. But you can get a 4K TV at 42 inches for like $250, right? So if you buy a 4K gaming monitor, it's going to cost you $600. John, that shouldn't be the case. CPU should make no difference at all. The memory might. And certainly big modules are more susceptible to that. But I found that all of those problems pretty much went away when I went with 64-bit Vassal, 64-bit Java, and increased the memory by about 4 times. So the fact that I've got 32 gigs of RAM is helpful. I don't think it's actually, at least on most computers, CPU should not be the bottleneck, really for anything that's running on Java. All right. I think we're caught up on the chat. Stegler, you should do that. I should do that. We should all do that. I did do a Vassal tutorial for the Georgetown University Wargame Society, which was about an hour. So it's not really padded. It is, but it's, let's call it leisurely paced. That was in the last year or so I don't want to do another one quite yet. Block Oddity, I assume you're talking about Empire of the Sun. That is a really, really outstandingly developed Vassal module, however. So, I never really noticed problems running it, to be honest. But it does have a bunch of relatively advanced features for Vassal modules with the overlays for the air zones of influence and all that stuff. It's all in there, and the overlays for the command ranges on the HQs and all that. Fantastic Vassal module by Francisco Colomares. You know, I'd have to research what the real minimum system requirements are for Vassal, to be honest. I don't know. It's never been a problem for me because I always, you know, for the duration of time I've been using Vassal, I've had a gaming computer, you know, even if it was a dated gaming computer, even one that's relatively old, should really not have a lot of trouble with Vassal. So by the way, let me get to this. I would like to thank a number of people for reasons that they know who they are. So I'd like to thank Zach Schaefer, Messing Up Rules, David Thompson, John Madison, Douglas Gearhart, Purple Norseman, Nathan Wise, Carol Creeder. Nathan Wise, of course, is friend of the channel from a long time ago. Rich DeFortuna, Hopshed NZ, Lee Grant, and some anonymous person. Thank you very much, all of you. You know why. So, and I'll guess I'll mention it now so I don't have to talk about it later. Links to a variety of things in the video description, including the Patreon merch store and Ko-Fi page, but also the Twitch page, and which I haven't actually streamed on Twitch in like 6 or 8 months, or maybe longer. I don't even know. But I'm looking at doing that again, actually. So we'll see. This stream might eventually also be on Twitch, but I'm not really set up to do that right now. And by setup, I mean that I have Twitch set up to be like my video game thing, and that's on a different channel, and I'm not paying Restream to go to 2 different YouTube channels. So we'll see what happens. There is not zero, but really close to zero tabletop wargame content on Twitch. So Brian Jarvis said, fine coffee mug. Mine is in the dishwasher, I think. I very seldom have what I need ready to go. So, in fact, I wanted to wear the Compass Games t-shirt tonight because they wore my t-shirt the other day, and I have no idea where it is. It's in some laundry basket somewhere. So, well, you will get, scotch is too expensive to ask. Send me $50 for a new bottle of scotch. But this stuff's, like I said, about 40, so I'm happy with that. So 90 people at the moment, but then I see 84, so I don't know what YouTube is even talking about. So we'll see. Cherry wine, that's interesting. I do occasionally wash the glassware. Find that is a good idea to prevent unfortunate things like botulism and or salmonella. So I may joke about salmonella from time to time, but I've had salmonella and it sucks. So highly recommended that you do not experience salmonella. So, and one thing that I think most people don't know, and I didn't, is that it can linger for like months. It won't always, but I was, on the other hand, it's like the easiest way to lose 30 pounds, because I lost 30 pounds in about a month, and I'll let you leave it as an exercise to the viewer to figure out which orifices the 30 pounds left via. So it was an unpleasant experience. Not recommended. So, now once I get these West Germans done, which was well in hand here, then I will have all of the units for Nato done, and not sure how long setup will take, but I guess we'll figure it out. Craig Campbell asks, what is the most detailed and realistic Normandy game? Well, you can play Omaha Beach and ASL rolls with using products that Critical Hit put out, if that's your thing. I find I'm going to differ with the phrasing of the question, because I think that detail is something you can definitely talk about, but realism is something that you probably is a term that we should be very careful when using. Because for a bunch of reasons. One, ultimately, every game contains abstractions, right? This is not a one-for-one physics engine that simulates everything according to the impartial laws of the universe, right? We are simulating these things using abstract mechanics, no matter how detailed those abstract mechanics might be. It's up to the designer to decide what he or she would like to abstract and what he or she doesn't care to abstract, right? But it's not even an either-or thing. It's not like we're abstracting this but not this. It's choosing a place on the spectrum of abstraction to put a specific mechanic, okay? It's all abstract. And the designer is making those decisions based on what the designer would like to talk about in the design. So when we say what game system is the most realistic, what do we mean, right? What do we mean that it best reflects reality from this angle or that angle? Does it best reflects the authentic use and demands upon artillery ammunition or command and control limitations or something like that? These are all questions that designers have asked in their designs. So it really, when we say realism, the term realism by itself means almost nothing, because what is realistic, right? It may be that it feels realistic in some specific aspect. I mean, ASL has things about it that feel realistic, but it is a monumentally abstract game, and it can many ahistorical things will happen in ASL. So I think realism is the wrong term. I think what most people actually mean when they talk about realism in this kind of conversational context is either believability or verisimilitude, neither of which are completely mapped to realism. So, I mean, TCS, for example, is a great example, because I feel like Dean Essig's designs are often more transparent about what they are interested in exploring than the works of some other designers. But this is not just true of Dean, right? So TCS has this thing called an op sheet where you actually have to write. I'm not sure they're called orders, but you're actually like writing out your unit's orders, and then you have to abide by those orders. That's going to result, I think, in units following those orders in a way that we might see as realistic. But at the same time, it's an abstract mechanism, right? It doesn't map one for one to the way those units were commanded historically. Also, I might mention on the topic of Normandy, there is an Omaha Beach Normandy game which covers half the beach anyway. There was supposed to be another second mod. At least I think there was supposed to be a second game in that series, so you'd get the whole beach. But also TCS Omaha, Bloody Omaha, I think it's called, doesn't use the order system for the landings themselves, which kind of eliminates a lot of the charm of playing TCS, I think. So, El Rolando, it has been asked already, so I'll sum up. This game, Nato, is a more detailed treatment of this topic than Iron Curtain is. I think the playtimes and footprint is similar. This is a 2-map game, where Iron Curtain is a 1-map game, but this is not a monster. This will take longer to play than Iron Curtain will, but not monumentally long. I think you can easily play this in 10 or 12 hours. You don't have quite the sandbox features of the scenario selection here as in Iron Curtain. Okay, let me state that more clearly. Iron Curtain has a wide and very sandboxy selection of scenarios that let you play out the Cold War gone hot in a bunch of different eras from the 40s to the 80s. This is set in the 80s, and there's three different start dates in the 80s here, so it's not like you don't have that element here. There's a few additional selections in Iron Curtain that you don't have here. Iron Curtain uses SCS, which is an 8-page rulebook. It is very simple. It is very easy to play. If that is something that you're looking for, then all means Iron Curtain is something that you should look at. If you want a more detailed simulation of the topic, this is, and yet without a huge monster game footprint or anything like that, then this is where I would look. This is a game that I think folks I'm talking to are very pleased with it. Let me put it that way. So, Kyle Reese mentions designer's notes, and this is true. You can, at least if they're good designer's notes, you can get a sense of what the designer is interested in exploring in the mechanics by reading the designer's notes, or by reading good designer's notes. Curry was here mentions the common trap that wargame designs fall into is that more complexity / chrome equals more realism, all at the segregates of playability. That's another sort of canard that I think does not hold up to scrutiny. I think, like I said, that there isn't like a switch that says this is realistic and this is abstract, where it's one or the other. You're always picking a point on the spectrum, and you're picking different points on the spectrum for different parts of the design. The parts that the designer is interested in exploring are going to be probably more detailed than the parts that the game designer doesn't care about. Right? If the game designer doesn't care about keeping track of artillery ammunition, probably you're going to not have a rule for that. Or you're going to have something very simple, but if the game designer is very interested in command and control, you're probably going to get some detailed rules about that. Now, there are, I think, a number of misunderstandings about the role of complexity in game design, and this, where I'm coming from on this at least, is a topic larger than wargaming, because I've seen it in role-playing games as well, where we have this idea that complicated games are inherently less playable and therefore less appealing and are therefore less popular. The problem with that is that it sounds sensible, or logical anyway. Harder games should be harder to get into, right? They should be less popular. Except they're not, and they never have been. What is the most popular traditional hex encounter war game is probably still ASL, and it is monstrously complex. All of the popular tabletop RPGs ever have been complicated. That started with AD&D, which has a even regular D&D, but I mean, my definitive exposure to early D&D was AD&D. It had a different rule for everything. You had like a whole separate combat system for unarmed combat, for example, that virtually nobody understood even at the time. You had a different rule for every spell. You had a different rule for every class. You had no uniformity of mechanics at all. Very complicated game system. Game systems like Shadowrun, and which some people felt were simpler, and in some respects they're simpler than D&D, but also even Vampire the Masquerade, which started out as a somewhat streamlined system, but by the Vampire the Masquerade 3rd edition was equal in complexity to any edition of D&D. So and these were the popular games like Rifts, for example, which is somehow miraculously still a thing. Hideously complicated and convoluted, very popular, remains available despite decades of publisher bumbling. So the idea that complicated that detail isn't necessarily correlated to complicated rules. Sometimes it is, and I think if it's well designed, it probably is, because then at least you're getting detail out of the complexity, right? There's no value in complexity by itself, but generally speaking, people want to play things that feel right. So they end up gravitating to relatively complicated things. Even the current edition of D&D is, a lot simpler and easier to play than a lot of previous editions of D&D, but at the same time, it's still more complicated than a lot of other RPGs, and is far more popular than a lot of other RPGs. So, now when we turn around and come back to wargaming on that, there are certainly examples of games that have gone over the top with complexity. And the obvious example, of course, has to be Campaign for North Africa, which has all kinds of ridiculous addendums or addenda. Oops, wrong tray. But, well, somebody asked what the most detailed Normandy game was, and I went off on my traditional rant. So that's where we are with that. So I think let me sum that up and say that I think when we ask that question, what we should be asking is what are we simulating, rather than is it detailed or is it not detailed. And now we're putting this back. It's not like we have ever stayed strictly on topic. Fast Times, thanks for stopping by. Generally speaking, so if we're going to ask what is the most detailed overall, the most detailed treatment of the Normandy campaign at the campaign level, right? So we're looking at battalion or regiment or division scale. That is available right now. The answer is unquestionably the Gauss Atlantic Wall from Decision. But Death Ride Normandy, isn't all out yet, so I'm not counting that yet. And it might be that might usurp that position at some point. That could happen. But, like we've also said, there's a lot of different levels at which a specific topic can be handled, right? I mean, we're handling it on a tactical level. Are we handling it on an operational level? Are we stepping back even from like the sort of nuts and bolts operational level to a game like the Mighty Endeavor, for example, which is an excellent game, and which is another kind of bigger than Normandy game, right? It handles everything from the invasion of Normandy in June 1944, pretty much to the end of the war. If you've got the new edition of it, it handles the East Front as well. Let's see. We'll figure out where these markers are going now. Stigler mentions SPI's Air War. I mean, I would apply, and he says it was very hard to learn, but once you learned it, it played very smoothly. I would say the same is true of Gauss, actually. It is a complicated, but it's a lot less burdensome to play than it looks like it's going to be. And that's another thing, and I've mentioned this before. Let's talk. You may recall that back in the day, Avalon Hill had a 10-point scale of complexity for their games. So I don't remember what a lot of them were, but I do know that it was a 1 to 10 scale, and the most complicated things were 10s. One of the things that was a 10, right? So what were 10s that I recall? Magic Realm was a 10, I believe. Squad Leader was a 10 if you played with Cross of Iron, Crescendo of Doom, and GI Anvil of Victory. Another thing that was a 10 was the Rise and Decline of the Third Reich, okay, which is a classic design which still endures today as a World at War and a couple other places as well. But it is very illuminating to go back and look at that rulebook today, because if any designer or publisher was rating that rulebook today, it would be no higher than a 7. So the idea of what constitutes complicated and what constitutes simple has also evolved over the years. And we might have that discussion at some other point about whether that's good or bad or whatever. But at the moment, a game like Third Reich, which was considered the literal pinnacle of complexity back in the day, it doesn't read as being all that complicated. I mean, if you look at, its direct descendant, A World at War, with its 200-plus page rulebook, it is obviously far more complicated. Okay. Hethwell says that detailing a game by introducing too many exceptions to action make the game complicated and dull, make it demanding and involved in details, but streamline few exceptions make it okay. I'm not 100% sure I'm following the discussion that line of talk, but if you mean that like a uniform mechanic is generally speaking preferable to a different rule for every little thing, I agree with that, but that is not a typical approach in wargames. Actually, it's quite common, but not universal in RPGs. But in wargames, it's pretty uncommon, actually. Jeff Beeler asks about OCS Normandy. So I will tell you about OCS Normandy, and I don't want to spoil anything. It's really, really, really early. So I don't think I can give you any information about OCS Normandy. I have shared a couple of screenshots on Twitter if you want to check those out. I don't think I can give you any information about OCS Normandy that will definitely be true in a year or two or whatever, however long it's going to take. It is early on in the process, and things are changing in a fairly dramatic way, literally from playtest to playtest. So that's about all I can say about OCS Normandy right now. And that's an unsatisfying answer, I know, and I apologize for that, but it's also the right answer. Casey Bill says the more complexity equals more realism equation has been demonstrated to be false. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But realism is the wrong term to use, and that's part of the reason why that's true. Now, I gravitate to complicated games. That is just me, right? Some people have different preferences, and that is fine as well. But my preference is for complicated games. In general, that's not just war games either. Very confused. Okay. Ah, cool. These are entrainment markers. Block Oddity, okay, so Stigler says that more complexity can make for a better, more challenging game than a beer and pretzels game. Sure, it can. But it's only one component in there, and it's probably not the component that is providing the additional depth of play. It is just an incidental byproduct of other things. John Madison mentions Rules in Flames, which I take to be a dig at World in Flames. What I will tell you this, the current edition of World in Flames is an order of magnitude less difficult to deal with than a World at War. It helps that a lot of the options have kind of been rolled into the core game as options rather than being in 10 million supplements that confuse everything. Block Oddity says people also mistake breaking with convention as complexity. I see less of that than I used to. One example of that I can think of is the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War, which a lot of people find difficult to grasp. At least back in the day. I think it's a lot less controversial now. But back when it was released, it seemed at least to me, it seemed very odd. That's not complexity. It's not a particularly complicated system, but it's different than what a lot of people's existing experience. So it seems more difficult than it is for that reason. I don't know that people are mistaking that for complexity as such, but they're certainly lumping it into the category of difficulty. Along with complexity. Simplest says, Husa says Heroes of Normandy, which I really am not familiar with at all. So I can't really speak to that. That seems like a more casual version of something like Company of Heroes, which I'm simply not the market for. So Kaiser Bill says Flat Top is a good example of good complexity, which I agree with. Flat Top's a relatively complicated game, but you get a lot out of it too. So certainly I have. Ken Clovey says Advanced Third Reich and TWE. Okay, so I'm interpreting that as Advanced Third Reich and TWE. I'm not sure what TWE is. I could be brain cramping, that's possible. In that there are many subsystems, but if you're a student of World War II, everything makes sense. After several playings, you're up to speed. That might be true, and certainly I've heard people say that about a World at War. And it is almost certainly true that A World at War is not as complicated as the 220-page rulebook necessarily suggests, but it is definitely not a simple game. And I also will point out that there are a number of really huge abstraction layers in the original Third Reich design, which are retained through to A World at War. Right, the whole BRP mechanism, which drives the entire game, is a huge abstraction level. Where you have this pool of like master points that you use to do everything. Huge level of abstraction that I think is not. It's not a like. It's a relatively intuitive abstraction, relatively, but it's still a big abstraction. Ken Cloby says he has a shrink-wrapped copy of Advanced Third Reich and a playable copy, and will be buying both the War Europe. Okay, the War Pacific. So I am not familiar with the War Europe and the War Pacific from Compass. Now, the War Pacific is coming out soonish, along with a reprint of the War Europe. Those games look good. They have a reasonably good reputation, but they don't have like the long-established player base of like a Third Reich or a World in Flames either. Which doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that they have a less established player base. I am super interested in those, so we'll see what what's in the cards for that. I am super interested in a relatively detailed hex and counter war games that cover the entire war in both Europe and the Pacific. In general, and fortunately, there's plenty of examples of that over the course of the lifetime of the hobby, right? There's not that. Okay, so maybe we should talk about this in a separate episode. But off the top of my head, you have the original Third Reich, which is just Europe, but then that is revised and expanded later into Advanced Third Reich and Rising Sun, or Empire of the Rising Sun, which covers the Pacific in I believe a fairly unsatisfying way. Because of the way in which the war in the Pacific is different than the war in Europe. I think that's unavoidable because the naval rules are just not detailed enough, I think, to be interesting in Rising Sun. So later on, that system turns into A World at War, which covers both Europe and the Pacific in one box and adds quite a bit of additional detail to the naval game. And I think, therefore, that in terms of just looking at the Pacific, I think you have a more interesting game in A World at War than you do in Rising Sun. Okay. There's World in Flames, of course, which has always handled the entire war worldwide in one box, for the entire lifetime of it. And it's, it's Australian design group, Harry Rowland design. It's on my short list of things that I would take with me to the desert island, I think. There's, we're going to have the War Europe and the War Pacific. Now, I will say that the titles on those are very unfortunate because they're very hard to search by. If you search for The War, for example, or The War Europe on BGG, you're going to end up with a million hits. You're going to have to figure out where the game you're looking for actually is. So, from a branding standpoint, I think the name is a mistake, but that doesn't mean the games are bad, and the games, like I said, are well liked by the people that like them. There's also Absolute Victory, also from Compass, which a lot of people like. I have leafed through a friend's copy, and it actually looks quite interesting. It is event-driven. There is an enormous book of random events that can occur in the context of the game, and frankly, the book of random events is probably worth the purchase price by itself. The maps are ghastly, but it does also include the entire planet, including, Antarctica. You have a map of Antarctica in that game, which is, I believe unique. There is the John Prados Third Reich sets from Avalanche, which was John Prados' Third Reich and the Great Pacific War. I believe you could combine those. Those do not have a good reputation. So, take that for what it's worth. There's the Axis Empires games from Decision. So, that's Totaler Krieg and Daisenso. And I have the same reservations with Daisenso as I have with Rising Sun, in that I think the level of abstraction applied to the air and naval, I think, does not lend itself to a standalone Pacific War game. So I think Senso is kind of a dud when played on its own, but can be engaging when played as, an extension of Total Krieg. There's a new edition of that coming out. One of the things in the new edition is a vastly expanded naval system, which might alleviate that problem completely, or it might completely break the game. I have no idea. We will see. Not sure if that's a this year thing or a next year thing, or I do know it's relatively soon from decision. So next year or so. One of the forgotten titles in this category is what I call ETO and PTO, which were TSR SPI games designed, I want to say, by Doug Niles. And that's European Theater of World War II European Theater of Operations and World War II Pacific Theater of Operations. And they're a bit different, but there are linking rules included. I don't know how well they work. I feel like at least the Europe one is actually a bit underappreciated. It's an evolution of the old SPI World War II. So I think that's a bit underappreciated as a title, and I would like to play it at some point. The maps are interesting looking, and the counters are not awesome. So I will say that. Carl Creeder, I don't think that's not something no, I believe that's always been the case, actually. Is the 200 character limit, and that's good, actually. I don't really care, but there are scenarios in which lengthy posts create problems. Husa, I mean, I assume I don't have to sell you on Empire of the Sun. If you are looking for the definitive strategic level simulation of the Pacific War, unless you are specifically interested in the land war parts of it, where you are not getting good simulation from Empire of the Sun, then I would point you at Empire of the Sun. If you're interested in the land war parts of it, good luck. Good luck. Pacific War, maybe. Which is not a land war game either, really, but it's an operational game. So if you're interested in more of an operational game, then Pacific War is something you want to look at. There is a chance that there will be another copy of Pacific War in the next sale wave, by the way. Stigler says that strategic by its very nature is unsatisfying to a gamer who likes battle narrative. That's definitely true. You do have a strategic narrative, however, or at least you can have a strategic narrative, which can be interesting, and in fact may be more interesting than the battle narrative. But that depends who you talk to. I have seen counters that have a lot of information on them, and sometimes it's fine. And I've seen counters with a relatively small amount of badly organized information, and they are visually confusing. One example, and I hate to bring this up as my example. One example is the counters from Battle Above the Clouds, Great Campaigns of the American Civil War. They redid the counter style, and I don't know what it is. I am not a graphic designer. I've not been trained or taken a class or anything like that. A little bit on graphic design, so I don't know why this is, but I find those unit counters and leader counters to be very visually confusing. Much more so than the old Avalon Hill style ones from the original games, or the new ones that they just, because everybody hated them and complained, because that's one of the things we're good at as a hobby, is complaining. You should. Empire of the Sun is worth your time. Empire of the Sun is an absolute masterpiece, and I recommend it in the highest possible terms, or strongest possible terms. Stigler says the GBACW counters, and that is a good example, actually. There's quite a lot of information on those GBACW counters. And and yet they are relatively easy to read. I won't say that you don't have to get a little bit used to them, because you do, but we didn't have a big problem with that. Yes, that is Lucky Forward back there. At some point, before too much longer, I need to get back to clipping that. I bought the trays. I needed additional trays to clip Lucky, to finish clipping Lucky Forward. I use these Container Store trays for the Goss games. And I went to the Container Store like 3 times, and they were out of those particular trays. But I did get them. So yes, you see Lucky Forward. The rest of the Goss series is on a shelf upstairs. I have the entire series. I'll also mention, for anybody interested in Goss, there is a sort of Goss light thing coming out in a World at War magazine late this year. It is the Battle of Hanut, or Hanut, or however the French pronounce it, in 1940. And it is both highly anticipated by me, and I am not sure it is not going to be a total disaster, because it might be. Trying to compress that game system into a magazine game. I mean, I imagine it'll have a bigger rulebook than your average magazine game, let me put it that way. But we'll see what it turns. There's also a lot of overhead in that game around supply and logistics and stuff like that this game, that you could ignore in a smaller game, right? You could just say, you get this many points to fuel divisions with, right? Stigler, that might be true. I mean, yes and no. I mean, certainly that is a thing that happens. There's also plenty of extremely skilled counter designers working in the hobby today, and I'm not going to make blanket statements about that. I mean, I love Mark Simonich's counters. I've seen good counters from Nadir El Farah, for example, off the top of my head. I'm not sure if Nick Scooby did the counters for GTS, but I like those counters. But that is a thing that you have to be concerned about, right, is presentation of information. And it's something that somebody like Redmond Simonson was, A, always concerned about, and B, the total master of. And, you know, I don't know that it's fair to modern counter designers to say, well, you're no Redmond Simonson, because nobody can be, right? So now I'll say ASL vehicle counters are incredibly information dense, and I haven't played enough ASL with vehicles to get used to the information presentation. Craig, that is a thing that the Goss training videos topic I agree with. There is behind the scenes drama not related to me going on with that. And I am not going to, I've commented on it elsewhere. I am not going to get into it again here tonight. I agree that it would be helpful. What game has pink Austrians? That sounds terrible. On the other hand, if you give a counterexample of the Der Weltkrieg counters, right, which are very clean. It's a testament to the simplicity of that system, right? There's a strength factor and a movement factor and a unit size and a symbol, and that's kind of it. I mean, you don't necessarily need to have a million different pieces of information on a counter, and yet that works out. I mean, that feels like a super detailed game. The rules are actually quite simple. Whoops. But it feels like a very detailed game, but a lot of that is the intricacy of the map. Balance of Powers was a graphically intriguing piece of graphic design. So I'm recalling this from memory, and I didn't look any of it up, so I believe it to be a John Gorkowski design. Callendale did a video review of it, was quite positive about it. Now, I've played it, and I think it's a pretty good game. It's one of the few World War I games that do two things. One is to give you some movement in the initial geopolitical situation that results in World War I in the first place, and the other is deal with the naval war in a satisfying way. Balance of Powers does both of those things. That is relatively uncommon. Other World War I games abstract one or both of those, or ignore the first of the two. And it's something that I like to see. Another game that does the first, but not really the second, is The Great War in Europe from Ted Racer, and originally from Command Magazine, but it eventually popped up in a deluxe edition from GMT. All right, let's see. Oh, we got blank counters in here for some reason. And I will say that the Der Weltkrieg counters are all appropriate colors. So, at least like nationally appropriate colors. Alright, and I think I'm done. Which means I'm taking the clipper with me tomorrow. I'm done with all the units. I'm not done with the markers. I'm willing to deal with the markers on an as-needed basis, I think. Because we are about 25 minutes from the end of the stream, and I am good on not clipping anymore tonight. So, let's get them all back in the box. Well, I mean, there was a whole lot of, like, political movement and activities and mobilizations and demobilizations and all kind of stuff that happens after the assassination of Archduke Franz, Archduke whatever his name was, and the actual, eruption of actual shooting war. I recommend, if you've seen it, John Keegan's book, The First World War, which covers a lot more than this, but it has a quite good introductory level discussion of all those geopolitical machinations that resulted in World War I happening in the first place. A very good book in general, actually. All right, so teaching NATO? Absolutely not. The good news is that there's a ton of content on NATO already on YouTube. Please check out my interview with Bruce Maxwell, where Bruce does a short combat walkthrough. And then Mo at Mo's Game Table has done a short scenario walkthrough of the Baltap scenario with Bruce. So check that out. So you might see some video out of me on it, but I doubt you'll see. You're definitely not going to see training video tomorrow. That ain't happening. So Stigler says, great mix of old and new design and production. He says, Jaws of Victory. Okay, so I have held Jaws of Victory in my own hands, and it is a beautiful package in a very retro way. It is I'm sure intentionally, a visual and tangible callback to an SPI design, okay? It doesn't look dated, but I mean, it's got the matte counters, and it's got sort of the classic wargame art style, which looks more like a Mark Simonich map than a Redmond Simonson map. But still, it's the kind of thing that you wouldn't have been shocked if SPI had stayed around for another 10 years. You wouldn't have been shocked to see that from SPI. It is a very well-done package. It appears to be a very well-developed game. New England Simulations takes a long time to produce a game, and it shows. They work on pretty much one game at a time, and they release a game every 3 to 5 years or something like that. And you can really tell that everything that they do gets a ton of care applied to it. But New England Simulations puts, they put out a game every 5 years, right? That is a different universe than a company like GMT or Compass or M&P exists in. They are, I don't want to say bigger companies necessarily, or even like a Revolution Games. They're probably bigger companies in some sense, but they're companies whose business is to produce multiple war games a year, right? And not a game every 5 years as a little side thing that's happening. So, We'll probably do a more detailed discussion of World War. I haven't really even gone off on World War One. We have done our traditional topical drift that we do almost every show, where the topic, let's face it, is a place to start, and it's not like we cannot discuss anything else other than the topic of choice. We have never done that here, so we talk about whatever I, in collaboration with the folks in the chat, want to drift on. So. And I have an opinion on everything. So whether that opinion is justified or well-founded or not is a totally different story. All right, Iggy Critical isn't just a guard doing Der Weltkrieg. Yes, I'm not sure how far he's gotten on video with that, but I just noticed that he did a video on it today. I have queued that up, but then I was getting ready for this. So, it is so really the signature thing about Der Weltkrieg. First of all, actually playing Der Weltkrieg reminds me a lot of playing OCS. It does a lot of the thing where it has you really have to move correctly, right? It is a puzzle. Also, you have a supply pool that you have to spend from to actually do things. Also, like OCS, but it is in general way less fussy than OCS. So, and me and one other guy are super excited about that series and want to get it to the table here at some point. And we might succeed at some point, but the guy whose house we play at is less excited about it. So that is what it is. I think the next thing from OCS is going to be their Eylau game, Napoleonic, Battle on Frozen Lakes. That should be super interesting. But I am not in the market for an Eylau game because the Eylau game is on its way to me literally today, as of today. So, incidentally, for anyone who's into the series, the Library of Napoleonic Battles from OSG, they're going to redo 4 Lost Battles, which is it's considered part of the Library of Napoleonic Battles series, but the Library of Napoleonic Battles series did not exist as a named thing when it came out. So they're going to update it to graphically the same standard as the rest of the series, which is noticeably better. And I think that's supposed to be out in 2022. So that's something to keep an eye out. It's not on their website yet. The only thing I see for pre-order from them is Napoleon in the Quadrilateral, which is one of the early Napoleonic campaigns in northern Italy. Super interesting looking game, by the way. And that is their release schedule tends to be February or March. So I don't have 4 Lost Battles, but The Coming Storm is on its way. So, we always have a sort of cool off period. I've been talking fairly intensely for the last 2.5 hours, so it's all good. Eylau in the Wellington's victory system. Really? Is that what that's going to be? Because that makes me not that excited about it. I got to tell you. Then again, maybe I'm short-selling the Wellington's victory system. Maybe it's glorious. I don't know. I have the Spitzer Wellington's victory, but not the SPI one. I had an opportunity to pick up a NATO division commander not that long ago, too, and I passed on that. I didn't, in the soapbox, I didn't feel like I needed it. So Paul McGillivray, first of all, welcome to the stream. I've seen your name before, so I think you're not new. Death Ride system is better for doing pieces of Normandy campaign. So the long-term goal for that series is actually to handle quite a lot of the campaign. So it's not even like pieces of the campaign. The other advantage of if historical setups is an issue in that series, at least with Normandy you can say that historical setups only matters half as much because it only matters for the Germans. The Allies all have to land. I don't know what the mechanism for that is in that series, but it's a pretty detailed series, so there's a pretty good chance it's detailed. If I were designing a Normandy game, which is not something that is in the pipeline, I would want a relatively involved system, which doesn't mean it'd be monstrously complicated, but I would want to give the player agency in terms of what they're bringing ashore, in terms of supply, if that's a thing in the game, in terms of, what kind of divisions are you bringing on? Are you bringing on infantry? Are you bringing on support units? Are you bringing on armored divisions? What are you bringing in your limited ability to land more stuff in the days following the invasion? So that is a thing I like in Normandy 44, is that you have this kind of big England pool, and you have, different things cost different amounts of points, and you can ship in what you can ship in based on the weather and the date. So I like that. That's how I would do it if I were doing Normandy and OCS, for example. OCS already has mechanisms for all of that stuff, so you'd have to make tweaks, but that's how I would do it. So. Wellington's victory was also used in, was it Ney versus Wellington as well? I might be misremembering that, because SPI did so many different Napoleonic games. Even the quads are different. Like Napoleon at War uses a completely different system than Napoleon's Last Battles, for example, and then Wellington's victory is different from that. Eylau is a really interesting battle. Eylau, I think, for me, is one of the two most interesting battles in the Napoleonic period. The other being Aspern-Essling. Eylau it's in East Prussia, or it's somewhere up there, and it takes place on a set of frozen lakes between Napoleon and the Russians. Waterbrunn, Ney versus Wellington. Okay, yeah. That's what I thought. I had that at one point, and I gave it away, I think. It's definitely a much smaller game than Wellington's victory. Much smaller game. Well, we're talking about Ney versus Wellington now. I mean, Quatre Bras is a much smaller battle than Waterloo, so I had kind of forgotten when I was looking at my copy of Napoleon's Last Gamble how big a battle Wavre was. It was actually quite a large battle, and you compare it to Quatre Bras, and you see the whole thing set up, because they're kind of adjacent battlefields, and you see like a few units, swirling around the crossroads at Quatre Bras, and you have this huge mass of formations at Wavre. So it's the one attractive thing about that series and Napoleon's Last Gamble specifically is that all of the battles take place in a relatively constrained area, so your campaign can actually be on one contiguous map. That's not the case in something like Napoleon against Russia, where you have battles that are hundreds of miles apart. Borodino is hundreds of, I don't know, but it's a long way away from Smolensk, which is another battle in the set. So you have to have the campaign rules in that are like, okay, so you make these adjustments to the deck depending on the result of the previous battle. Where in the Napoleon's Last Gamble set, you can actually set the whole map up and say, okay, here's where you start, go, and have a campaign. That feels like a real campaign and not a a quasi campaign of somewhat connected individual battle scenarios. That is the Hemidad. That is the Battle of Monmouth, and interestingly, that is the very last SPI Strategy and Tactics magazine. 91, issue number 91, something like that. And I believe that does use the Wellington's Victory system. And I do have that, actually. My copy has very badly registered counters, however. So if I read, it's a small game, so if I ever want to play it, I might just make my own counters. I am not really... So I feel like I have the several volumes in the Battles of the American Revolution series from GMT, and I feel like that is where I can begin and end my library of tactical American Revolution engagements. I am not sufficiently interested in American Revolution at that scale to have any other ones. At higher scales, I have 1776. That's something I picked up again. Because a lot of stuff friends say, oh, I got a copy of 1776. You said you wanted it, so here you go. Here's $10 or whatever, whatever it was. So I got a copy of 1776. That's kind of a pretty cool game, actually. It's pretty much the War and Peace system. It's a Mark McLaughlin design. And I've got Liberty or Death, which is the Harold Buchanan coin game, which I actually like a lot. It's one of my favorite coin games. I also have Harold's Campaigns of 1777, which is a Decision Games S&T game from a couple years ago, which was very well received. I may have done a video on it, but I think the Player's Aid did an actual review of it. So I have the American Revolution tri-pack, which is Saratoga, Brandywine, and I forget what the other one was. Do I slim it down here? No, it's mag rated upstairs. So, Guilford Courthouse, and then there's Utah Springs is in there as well. So, 1776 is a pretty good game. I mean, War and Peace is a pretty good game, right? There's a reason why people still wanted it. There's Avalon Hill version will probably be in a future sale wave, by the way. I have the new fancified version of it from One Small Step. It is very nice. I don't know if it fixes the campaign, to be blunt. I think that's one of those designs where I think it wasn't really set up with that in mind. It doesn't really shine in the context of the grand campaign. And you have this entire additional 50-page rule book just to handle the grand campaign. I'm not sure it's worth it. But the operational scenarios are tons of fun. So, John Longshore, I saw you mention that right at the top of the stream, and I didn't mention it at the time. I am not really... that is not really on my radar, I have to say. I like a lot of the stuff that Worthington is doing, I will tell you that. I don't like... Well, let me state this more clearly in a less cavalier way. I forgot to poop. I forgot to send out the tweets. Oh, well. Too late now. Worthington Games... Worthington's got some I think really good designs. They don't necessarily do 100% of their stuff is not necessarily of interest to me. Hidden Strike American Revolution by Maurice Suckling and Dorian Richard or Dorian Richard. Not sure how you would pronounce that. Who said so? There's a real interesting looking one coming out from Compass called 1812 with an exclamation point. That is the 18. I think that is going to end up being my 1812 game. I don't have, do I not? I might have a magazine game on the War of 1812, but that's it. It is a relatively interesting topic. So look for 1812 from Compass. That's kind of where I'm looking right now. Is this entirely a solitaire game? No, apparently not. 3 to 5 players. That's kind of cool. This looks intriguing. Not necessarily, part of my purview as such, but it actually looks intriguing. It might be interesting to look at. Another thing that Worthington has coming is the new version of Soviet Dawn, which is to Darren Leveloff. I've got a playthrough video of that. I imagine it's not changing very much. There was no need to change it other than to upgrade the components, for example. I've heard good things about Mr. Madison's War. So Mr. Madison's War is designed by Gilbert Collins, who you may be familiar with from his fabulous YouTube channels. Check that out. I don't pimp Gilbert. Well, I pimp Gilbert all the time. But I talk about how good Gilbert's channel is all the time. But he's not the channel of the week because he's got like more subscribers than me. He does not need my endorsement. So he is also the designer of the upcoming War for America from Compass. That is also on my super highly anticipated games of 2021 list. So, I don't think 1812 is coming, and I have an interview with the designer of 1812 back in the channel history. It's pretty brief, so, it's not like a huge time commitment to watch it or anything. But check that out. It's a super interesting looking game. I haven't done I did an unboxing video of Worthington's Struggle for Europe. Which is advertised as a game, a World War II in Europe that you can play in 2 hours, and it is absolutely that. It does exactly what it says it is going to do on the box. It took us like exactly 2 hours to play, and it came down to the very last turn. So it's more abstract than my preferences indicate, but it's a very solid game for what it is. Custer's Last Stand, Cowboys, not interested in a lot of this stuff, right? Their French and Indian War is relatively recent, too. That's actually supposed to be... That might be good. Maybe not. I don't know. Hard to say. Their Crusades game I was tempted by, but I have 3 Crusades games already, and I think I'm satisfied with my current selection. Between Onward Christian Soldiers, which is a Richard Berg GMT game, which is a really interesting game, actually. What's the one from MMP is Kingdom of Heaven, which I also have, which I haven't really looked at that closely. And I also have the First Crusade from S&T, which is busted. And I have one other Crusades game. I've got Infidel now as part of the Men of Iron tri-pack, so I've got Tactical Crusades if I want it as well. So, one thing that Worthington is doing that I like is that they're doing games on a lot of those like early North American conflicts that we don't necessarily see a ton of coverage on, like the War of 1812 and American Revolution and stuff like that. We don't really see that much American Revolution stuff, right? It's not an ignored topic, but so there's a lot of good. Just looking at it, there's a lot of good stuff here. I'm substantially less interested in like their World War II things. Even though the Holdfast series, at least the East Front one, is supposed to be pretty good. Is this the game Sea Kings? Is this a game about Vikings? It totally is. Looks very abstract. Jackson and Sheridan and Grant's Gamble are supposed to be pretty decent as well. And those, I think, are point-to-point block games, if I'm not mistaken. I would imagine they're relatively akin to the Columbia Napoleon game, I would imagine. If you want a non-abstract, well, I mean, again, they're all abstract, right? If you want a detailed game, you might even say fussy, game on the Crusades, the one I would point at the Levantine Crusades, the one I would point you to is Onward Christian Soldiers from, again, GMT and Richard Berg. It has multiple scenarios for the different Crusades. There's offhand, I think there's a first, second, and third Crusade scenarios, which all play like completely different games. The interesting Crusade to me is the first Crusade, not the third Crusade. And there's like a very interesting multiplayer First Crusade scenario in that game. So that is a game that I think is worth a look. I stopped short of saying I recommend it because I haven't actually played it, but I've owned it for many years. It is one of those GMT games that did not ever leave my collection. And I would like to get it to a table at some point. Maybe I should pitch it to the weekday group. That would be interesting. So, I would like to be able to talk more about publishers that I don't typically talk about that much, like Worthington and Revolution Games and Legion Wargames. All 3 of them have... or Lock and Load Tactical. I'd love to talk more about Lock and Load Tactical. I love the company. I'm not interested in very many of their products, and that's my problem. The company's doing a lot of really good stuff. So, all right. There's at least that one Reconquista game from Compass that's coming that's based on the Sekigahara system. That might be really good. I don't know. And there's another game coming out from somebody else that is on the Reconquista. It's another very interesting subject that is not traditionally gotten a lot of action in the wargaming sphere. So I forget what it's called, but it's available for pre-order now from Compass. But it is a game about the Reconquista, and it uses the block system from Sekigahara. So the joke between Ohio and Michigan is that we fought a war over Toledo, and the loser had to keep Toledo. So Ohio lost. So I mean, Armored Christian Soldiers is a bird game, right? So it is certainly not the most extreme example of Berg getting lost in his own fussiness, but it is, like a lot of bird games of that era, it is prone to that. That is there. So I would not necessarily. I think you would probably have to be a little bit patient with it. I think you have to be a little bit patient with the Ancient World games as well, because they also fall in that era. I've heard good things about the Toledo Zoo, actually, and I suppose the art museum in Toledo is really good. Many, many years ago, we had a decision. We were literally we're getting on the highway to go to Toledo because we're going to go to the Toledo Art Museum, and we said we could get on 80 West and go to Toledo, or we could get on 80 East and go to New York City. What do you want to do? And we said we'd go to New York City, so that's what we did instead of going to Toledo. Not that I've never been to Toledo. I've been to Toledo several times, but Fort Meigs in Toledo is worth going to if you're there. It is not the original fort; it is reconstruction, but it's still pretty fascinating. So, all right, it is 10 p.m. I will go for another couple of minutes because I have another sip or two here, but we will be wrapping up in the next 5 minutes or so. So, what is ahead this week? There is a stream with Dan at 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday. It is Dan's week, but it might be here. So check here, check at No Enemies here, and I have to yell at Dan about a variety of things, actually. So I think that will be happening. There will be an unboxing video on Thursday. I have not yet edited that unboxing video from the large pile of unboxing videos that are in the wings. So I don't know what it will be yet, but it will be something. It won't probably be anything like new. I don't expect anything to arrive in unboxing condition between now and then. So I would like to thank everybody for stopping by. I appreciate that folks are still here after the, not non-show of last week. I do hope to, I'll also, one more thing I have to mention is that the sale video I'm not going to take the video down, but I will put a thing in the post-it in the pinned comment that wave of sale is over. So if you want to rewatch that and see if there's a lot of the magazine games are still there and a few of the box games. So anybody wants anything out of that video, follow the instructions in the video in the next 24 hours, or you are going to lose your shot. It will all be back up at some point, but if you want anything in there, let me know. So, I will not accept inquiries through any other means than email. There are ample instructions in the video. There's somebody who I assume was being a wise ass. Like, what's your email address again? I can't find it. I showed it 50 times during the video. So I would like to thank everybody for stopping by. I really appreciate everybody that keeps stopping by from week to week. Always happy to see new folks here in the stream as well. Always happy to see the very vibrant conversation. I love the way the conversation just drifts around sometimes. So I appreciate the thoughts that I've gotten since what happened last week happened too. So that is also appreciated. I would like to wish everyone a great night, and as of this very moment, it's hard to predict exact scheduling right now, as you can imagine, based on what we talked about at the very beginning. But the plan is to be live again next Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So I would like to wish everybody will join me next week, and we have other videos in the meantime. So thanks for stopping by, everybody, and have a great night. Happy